December 19, 1944. Deep beneath Whitehall, the war room's breathed like a bunker under siege. Maps were pinned, repinned, and stabbed with fresh markers as if steel could somehow hold back catastrophe. Coal smoke hung in the air. Boots echoed. Phones rang and rang again. At the center of it all stood Winston Churchill, staring at Western Europe. By every known rule of warfare, the situation was already lost. 3 days earlier, German forces had erupted out of the Ardennes in a surprise assault that shattered Allied assumptions. Now a massive bulge had been driven into the front deep, fast, and violently. Entire American divisions were cut off. Roads were clogged with refugees, wounded men, abandoned vehicles. Snow smothered everything. The sky itself had turned against the Allies, grounding air power and silencing the one advantage they trusted most. Logic was merciless. This kind of blow did not get reversed quickly. Not in winter, not without preparation, not without time. And time was the one resource the Allies no longer possessed. British planners estimated weeks minimum to stabilize the front. American staff officers quietly agreed. Even optimists spoke in days measured by blood. Then a message arrived. It came not with explanation, not with apology, but with a deadline so aggressive it bordered on insanity. Churchill read it once, then again. Around him, senior officers watched his expression harden, not with hope but with something more dangerous, disbelief. The message came from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. It relayed a promise made directly to Dwight D. Eisenhower by a man many considered brilliant, reckless, or both. General George S. Patton had committed to launching a major offensive within 48 hours. Not a probe. Not a diversion, a full-scale attack. Churchill finally broke the silence. 48 hours, he repeated aloud, letting the words sit like a verdict. No rational commander would attempt this. Either the man is a genius or he is lying. History insists this should have ended there. Because what Patton was proposing defied not just enemy strength but mathematics. His Third Army was pointed the wrong direction, deeply engaged to the east, driving toward Germany. To strike north, Patton would have to disengage entire corps while still under contact, rotate an army 90 degrees, reroute its supply chain, and force tens of thousands of vehicles onto frozen roads already clogged with chaos. In winter, under enemy pressure, with no air support, by every accepted doctrine such a maneuver required weeks of planning and preparation. Patton was offering days, and not even full days, hours. At the heart of the crisis lay Bastogne, a crossroads town now surrounded on all sides. Inside it, American paratroopers were freezing, wounded, and running out of ammunition. German armor was tightening the ring. Every mile of delay made relief less likely, surrender more logical. The enemy believed time was finally on their side, so did most Allied commanders. What none of them knew, what made Patton's promise so unsettling, was that he had not spoken impulsively. While others were still trying to understand what the Germans had done, Patton had already decided what he would do in response. He had watched the bulge form on the map and seen not disaster but exposure. The enemy had lunged forward, stretching their supply lines, committing their reserves into narrow roads and forests. By every known rule of warfare, this was an invitation, if someone was fast enough to exploit it. Patton had quietly ordered his staff to prepare for that exact moment. Alternate plans, rerouted fuel dumps, movement schedules drawn up in advance. Commanders warned to expect impossible orders without warning. He had planned for a crisis no one else believed could be answered. When Eisenhower asked how fast Third Army could move, Patton didn't calculate, he remembered, but memory alone does not move armies. On the ground, the situation was brutal beyond abstraction. Engines froze overnight. Men slept in ditches beside their vehicles. Convoys stretched for miles through snowstorms that erased landmarks and swallowed sound. Every hour wasted meant another unit trapped, another town lost. German intelligence officers were already reporting Allied paralysis. They believed the Americans were scrambling, disorganized, reactive. They were wrong. And yet, even now, nothing was guaranteed. Because the first order had not yet been given. If Patton failed to move on time, the promise would collapse into humiliation. If his columns stalled, Bastogne would fall. If German forces reacted faster than expected, Third Army could be smashed while exposed mid-maneuver. This was not boldness. This was gambling with an entire army. As night fell on December 19th, engines were still silent. Maps still lay flat. Orders still waited to be spoken aloud. And somewhere south of the encirclement, tens of thousands of men stood on the edge of movement that, by every rational calculation, should have been impossible. History had drawn its line. In the next 48 hours, it would decide whether Patton was a liar, or whether war itself was about to be rewritten. December 20, 1944, before dawn the order finally moved, not cautiously, not incrementally, but all at once. Engines ignited across 100 frozen assembly areas. Columns that had spent weeks grinding east suddenly pivoted north, like iron limbs forced against the joints of geography. Maps were torn down and replaced. Radio frequencies changed mid-transmission. Units still exchanging fire with German forces were ordered to disengage, not tomorrow, not when convenient, but now. By every accepted rule of warfare, this was madness. Armies do not turn while fighting. They pause, they consolidate, they wait for logistics to catch up. What Patton demanded instead was movement without permission from reality itself. Entire corps were told to reverse direction on roads never meant to carry such weight. Snow narrowed lanes already cratered by retreating traffic. Bridges groaned under tanks that exceeded their limits. Fuel trucks slid into ditches. Drivers navigated by memory when landmarks vanished beneath white silence. There was no margin for error. Every mile north consumed fuel meant for east. Every hour spent moving exposed flanks to German counterblows. The supply chain, normally a rigid spine, was now being bent while under load. Staff officers understood what this meant. If even one critical node failed, one bridge blown, one fuel depot missed, the movement would collapse into paralysis. Third Army would become a traffic jam of steel, frozen in place, ripe for destruction. And still, Patton pushed. He did not issue encouragement, he issued deadlines. Reports flooded in, not asking if the move could be done, but how much faster it could be forced. Units were ordered to march through the night. Mechanics repaired vehicles by lantern light, fingers numb, tools slipping from hands. Men slept in 15-minute intervals beside running engines to prevent freezing. No rational commander would attempt this under winter conditions. Yet by mid-morning, lead elements had already cleared choke points Allied planners believed would halt movement for days. Observers at higher headquarters began to notice something unsettling. The army was not slowing down. It was accelerating. German intelligence, tracking radio traffic and intercepted reports, struggled to reconcile what they were seeing. Movement indicators appeared in places that should not have been reachable yet. Units were arriving ahead of schedules that German staff officers had calculated as physically impossible. Their assumption that the Americans would need time was collapsing, but inside the German lines, confidence still reigned. They believed the encirclement around Bastogne would hold. The defenders were isolated. Ammunition was running low. Relief attempts, if they came at all, would be piecemeal and easily repelled. They did not yet understand that this was not a relief attempt. It was a collision. As Third Army surged north, the weather worsened. Temperatures plunged. Snow thickened into blinding sheets. Visibility dropped so low that convoys drove by sound, following the engine noise of the vehicle ahead. When that sound vanished, panic followed. Accidents multiplied, vehicles overturned. Men were crushed between trailers and tanks. Wounded soldiers were loaded onto supply trucks because ambulances could not reach them. There was no pause to mourn. Every delay threatened the schedule. At Allied headquarters, disbelief gave way to unease. The speed was real, but so was the risk. If German forces pivoted faster than expected, Patton's columns could be struck while stretched thin, road-bound, and exposed. This was the nightmare scenario planners had warned against for decades. And yet reports continued to arrive, crossroads secured, column through ahead of schedule, resistance bypassed. One senior intelligence officer noted grimly that Third Army was now moving faster than Allied reconnaissance could reliably track it. The implications were disturbing. This was no longer controlled movement. It was momentum. And momentum, once lost, could not be recovered. Back in London, Churchill followed the updates with growing intensity. What had begun as skepticism had transformed into something sharper. Not admiration, not yet, but recognition. He understood logistics. He understood friction. He understood that what Patton was attempting was not just aggressive, it was structurally fragile. One error, one delay, one German counterstroke at the wrong time, everything would unravel. And there was another complication. Not all Allied commanders were watching with approval. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, responsible for stabilizing the northern sector, favored methodical buildup and tight control. From his perspective, Patton's movement threatened coordination. An army moving too fast could create gaps just as dangerous as moving too slow. The philosophical divide was reopening at the worst possible moment. Caution versus speed, control versus momentum, and the battlefield would decide which survived. By nightfall on December 20th, Third Army had covered distances that planning tables said required twice the time. But exhaustion was mounting. Engines failed, men collapsed beside their vehicles. Units began to report contact with German screening forces, evidence that the enemy was starting to react. The window was closing. Patton's gamble now depended on one thing alone: whether the Germans could reorganize fast enough to stop him. Because if they could, Third Army would be caught mid-turn, neither facing east nor north, vulnerable on every axis. History insists this is where such operations fail. And as December 21st approached, German commanders began issuing new orders of their own. Orders that would test whether speed could outrun steel. December 21, 1944. By dawn, the illusion collapsed. Inside German headquarters, the first consolidated intelligence reports were finally assembled. They did not describe chaos. They did not describe hesitation. They described velocity. Multiple American divisions were detected moving north at speeds that violated German planning assumptions, not advancing cautiously, not probing. Advancing with commitment, columns flowing through routes the Germans believed would be clogged for days. For the first time since the offensive began, German officers hesitated. By every known rule of warfare, such movement should not have been sustainable. Armored formations required rest, resupply, coordination. Winter alone should have crippled momentum, yet the Americans were not slowing. They were converging. The encirclement around Bastogne had been designed with one assumption: that relief, if attempted, would come late and fragmented. German panzer units were positioned to repel a methodical advance, not to absorb a sudden high-speed collision. Now reports indicated something far worse. The relief force was not approaching from a single axis. It was fanning out, probing for weak seams, bypassing strongpoints, ignoring doctrinal neatness in favor of time. German commanders began issuing frantic counterorders. Units were redirected mid-march. Fuel earmarked for offensive operations was siphoned off to block roads. Reserve formations, never meant to be committed this early, were thrown into hasty defensive lines. The offensive timetable was unraveling. The deeper problem was psychological. The Germans had planned their assault believing the Allies would respond as they always had, slowly, deliberately, predictably. They had assumed the Americans, in particular, would need time to think. Patton had denied them that. Inside Bastogne, the situation remained dire. The town was ringed by German armor and infantry. Shelling was constant. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Wounded men lay on straw and frozen floors. Ammunition was rationed to individual rounds. The defenders fought on faith alone. They had been told relief would come. They had not been told when. German negotiators, sensing desperation, demanded surrender. The reply they received was brief, defiant, and meaningless without reinforcement. Courage could not stop tanks. South of the encirclement, the spearhead of Third Army began to encounter organized resistance. This was no longer screening fire. German units were digging in along road junctions, villages, and high ground. Patton did not slow. He ordered resistance bypassed where possible, crushed where necessary. He accepted temporary isolation of units if it meant preserving momentum. Commanders were authorized to make decisions without waiting for approval, an extraordinary delegation of authority under such conditions. This was not chaos, it was controlled aggression. By every rational calculation, it should have collapsed under its own weight. Instead, the pressure mounted. German commanders now faced an impossible dilemma. If they reinforced Bastogne's encirclement, they weakened their offensive elsewhere. If they held their offensive posture, they risked being pierced and rolled up from the flank. Either choice was fatal. The Americans had forced the Germans to react. That alone marked a turning point. At Allied headquarters, reports shifted tone. What had been framed as a desperate gamble was now being discussed as a race, one the Americans were no longer losing. Churchill read update after update with mounting intensity. The pace disturbed him. It contradicted decades of British staff doctrine, and yet results were undeniable. The Germans were no longer dictating events. They were chasing them. Weather continued to punish both sides. Frostbite cases mounted. Vehicles froze in place overnight. Men died of exposure without ever seeing the enemy. But Patton's logic remained brutally simple. The enemy suffered the same cold. The difference was movement. By December 22nd, forward elements of 4th Armored Division were within striking distance of the outer German defenses. The town of Bastogne lay just beyond a belt of enemy positions that had been hastily reinforced and poorly coordinated. German units dug in with whatever they had. Tanks were positioned hull down in villages never meant to be fortresses. Infantry units arrived without heavy weapons, ordered to hold ground at all costs. This was not a planned defense, it was a desperate one. And desperation cuts both ways. Inside Bastogne, American defenders could hear the change. The pattern of shelling shifted. German attacks became more violent and more hurried. The encirclement was tightening even as the relief force closed in. Both sides understood what this meant. The Germans were trying to crush the defenders before relief arrived. The Americans were racing against annihilation. By nightfall, the distance between Patton's lead tanks and Bastogne had shrunk to a handful of miles. But those miles were the most heavily defended. This was where the operation would either justify its madness or collapse into catastrophe. History insists this is the moment where speed meets steel. And as December 23rd approached, German commanders prepared to make their stand, because if Bastogne held just a little longer, the impossible might actually arrive. December 23, 1944. The weather broke, and with it the illusion that time could still be negotiated. Clear skies returned over the Ardennes, exposing everything: columns, positions, movement. For the first time in days, Allied aircraft clawed back into the sky. But visibility cut both ways. The Germans could now see what was coming, and they understood this was not a probing attack. This was a deadline. Inside Bastogne, the defenders were reaching the edge of physical collapse. Frostbite outnumbered combat wounds. Bandages were reused. Morphine was rationed like gold. Men fought on exhaustion, sustained by nothing but discipline and the certainty that surrender meant annihilation. German artillery intensified. Infantry assaults came in waves, probing for weakness, hammering the perimeter. The encirclement was being squeezed with deliberate cruelty. The defenders did not know it yet, but relief was finally close enough to be heard. South of the town, Patton's spearhead collided with the German blocking force at Assenois. The village sat astride the most direct route into Bastogne, its narrow roads lined with stone buildings turned into fortresses overnight. By every known rule of warfare, this attack should have waited. Artillery preparation, flank security, consolidation, there was no time. Patton issued the order that defined the operation: attack through. The 4th Armored Division went in head-on. Tanks advanced through icy streets under fire from concealed anti-tank guns. Infantry clung to the armor, slipping on frozen ground, clearing buildings room by room. German resistance was ferocious. They knew what was at stake. Every hour they delayed, the Americans brought them closer to crushing Bastogne from within. Vehicles burned. Men were killed before they could dismount. Progress slowed to yards measured in blood, but it did not stop. This was the final test of Patton's wager. Speed had brought Third Army to the gates, but steel and flesh would decide whether they opened. At Patton's command post, updates arrived in fragments: progress, resistance, casualties, delays. Each message carried the weight of failure or survival. He did not intervene. He trusted momentum. German commanders now faced a collapse of coherence. Units thrown together in haste lacked coordination. Artillery struggled to keep pace with shifting lines. Fuel shortages crippled counterattacks. The Germans were fighting bravely but reactively. They were no longer controlling the battle. By December 24th, the sound of tank engines echoed faintly inside Bastogne. Paratroopers froze mid-task, listening. It could have been imagination. It could have been death approaching, but it was real. Outside the town, American armor pressed forward under constant fire. German defenders fought to the last round, but cracks began to appear. Units fell back without orders. Gaps opened. Communications failed. History insists this is where relief often fails, where the final push collapses under exhaustion and resistance. Instead, Patton's men kept moving. On December 26, 1944, in the late afternoon, American tanks finally broke through the last German positions and rolled into Bastogne. The encirclement was pierced, not destroyed, but shattered. The radio message was short: contact made. Inside the town, men who had not slept properly in days stared in disbelief. Some laughed, some cried. Some simply sat down in the snow, too exhausted to react. Relief had arrived not on December 27, 1944. The corridor into Bastogne was open, but barely. A single narrow artery cut through German-held territory, constantly shelled, constantly threatened. Trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies raced in under fire. Wounded men were rushed out over roads that could close at any moment. Relief had come, but safety had not. German commanders responded with fury. Counterattacks slammed into the corridor, attempting to sever it before it could be reinforced. Artillery pounded the roads day and night. Infantry assaults probed relentlessly, searching for weakness. This was the cost of speed. Patton had arrived early, but early meant exposed. By every known rule of warfare, the prudent course now would have been consolidation. Widen the corridor, secure flanks, build defensive depth. That is what doctrine demanded. Patton did not slow. He ordered continued pressure, expanding the breach, forcing the Germans to react rather than recover. Units were rotated through the corridor without pause. Logistics convoys ran on schedules measured in minutes, not hours. Third Army was now fighting on exhaustion. Men who had marched and fought for days without rest were ordered forward again. Frostbite cases surged. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Mechanics worked until they collapsed beside engines still warm from operation. The logistical strain was staggering. Fuel consumption reached levels planners had considered unsustainable. Ammunition expenditure spiked as German counterattacks intensified. Supply officers rerouted tens of thousands of tons of material on the fly, rewriting movement tables as shells fell around them. By every rational calculation, this tempo should have burned the army out. Instead, it burned the enemy first. German units were now being forced to fight on Patton's schedule. Their counterattacks lacked coordination, launched piecemeal by formations already depleted and short of fuel. The same winter that punished the Americans punished them harder, because they were reacting, not advancing. Inside Bastogne, the human cost was unmistakable. Paratroopers emerged from cellars and foxholes looking older than their years. Many were evacuated immediately, suffering from exposure and wounds that would have been fatal without relief. They had held just long enough. News of the relief spread quickly through Allied commands. What had begun as skepticism hardened into grudging respect. Patton had not merely succeeded, he had overturned assumptions. Nowhere was that felt more sharply than in London. Winston Churchill read after-action reports with growing fascination. Distances covered, timelines shattered, German reactions outpaced. He understood what this meant. This was not luck. Luck did not move supply depots. Luck did not rotate divisions under fire. Luck did not sustain momentum for 7 days in winter combat. This was a different way of fighting. Privately, Churchill began asking uncomfortable questions. Why had British doctrine insisted such speeds were impossible? Why had caution been treated as virtue rather than vulnerability? Not everyone shared his growing admiration. Senior British officers warned that Patton's methods were dangerous, reliant on fortune, unsustainable in the long term. They argued that Bastogne was an exception, not a model. Churchill listened, but he also compared outcomes. Patton had done in 1 week what others said would take 3. The contrast was impossible to ignore. German high command felt the consequences immediately. The failure to destroy Bastogne unraveled the broader offensive. Resources committed to the encirclement were now trapped, bled white by constant pressure. Strategic surprise, the foundation of the German plan was gone. From this point forward, the initiative on the Western Front would not return to German hands. And all of it traced back to one decision, to treat time as a weapon. By the end of December, the Germans were no longer attacking toward Antwerp. They were fighting to escape encirclement themselves. The tide had turned, not slowly, not methodically, but violently. Churchill would later reflect on this moment as something more than a tactical success. It was a demonstration. Proof that modern warfare rewarded audacity when paired with preparation. But even now, admiration came with unease. Because if Patton was right, then much of what the Allies believed about warfare was wrong. And that realization would reshape the final months of the war. January 1945. The guns around Bastogne still thundered, but the question had already shifted. Not could the Germans be stopped, but how quickly the Allies could now move. In London, Winston Churchill studied reports late into the night. He had spent decades around soldiers, plans, and promises that collapsed under reality. He trusted caution because caution survived, yet here was something that refused to fit the pattern. Patton had not waited for perfect conditions, he had not waited for consensus. He had not waited for certainty, and he had won. Churchill understood the implications immediately and they unsettled him. British operational doctrine prized preparation, synchronization, and minimizing loss. Speed was desirable, yes, but only after every variable was controlled. Patton had inverted that logic. Speed came first. Control followed if it could. During planning sessions for the next phase of the war, the contrast became unavoidable. Discussions about crossing the Rhine dragged on, heavy with conditions and caveats. Timelines stretched. Risks were enumerated. Churchill interrupted. He referenced the Ardennes. An American army had turned 90 degrees in winter, advanced under fire, and shattered a German encirclement in 7 days. And here they were debating weeks to move fractions of that distance under better conditions. The room fell silent. This was not a rebuke delivered publicly, but it was unmistakable. Across the channel, Bernard Montgomery bristled. He had stabilized the front. He had restored order. His methodical approach had saved lives, but Patton's success cast a shadow. Montgomery argued that Patton's methods were reckless, that American material superiority masked inefficiency and waste. British forces, he insisted, could not afford such extravagance. Churchill listened, then asked the question no one wanted to answer. Was caution saving lives? Or extending the war? It was a dangerous thought. One Churchill had resisted for years. Britain had bled too deeply to gamble lightly, but the evidence was mounting. The Germans were not collapsing under pressure alone, they were collapsing under tempo. German commanders captured after the Ardennes spoke of exhaustion, confusion, and the inability to react fast enough. They did not describe overwhelming firepower. They described being late, late to reposition, late to reinforce, late to recover. Patton had not merely defeated German units, he had denied them time itself. Churchill began referencing the Bastogne operation in private correspondence, then cautiously in public remarks. He praised bold leadership married to preparation. He highlighted speed without naming it directly. Those listening closely understood. This was an evolution. For a man who had championed careful buildup and attrition, it was a significant shift. Churchill was not abandoning caution, but he was no longer convinced it deserved primacy. In internal discussions, he framed Patton's achievement not as an exception but as a warning. A demonstration of what modern mechanized warfare demanded: accept imperfection, move before certainty, trust commanders to adapt. These ideas unsettled British planners raised on order and hierarchy. Yet the war itself was running out of patience. By February 1945, Allied armies were surging toward Germany on multiple axes. Everywhere Patton's Third Army moved, it continued to display the same traits: relentless momentum, decentralized decision-making, and intolerance for delay. Churchill watched closely. He did not excuse Patton's flaws. The man was profane, politically dangerous, and often infuriating, but results mattered, they always had, and the results were undeniable. The Ardennes had been the last German gamble in the West. It failed not because it lacked courage, but because it was outrun. Churchill would later say that Bastogne forced him to confront a simple truth. Wars are not won by perfect plans, but by commanders who understand when time itself is the battlefield. That realization reshaped how he viewed the final push into Germany, and it reshaped how he viewed Patton. Not as a liability, not as a risk to be managed, but as a weapon, one that had changed the war's trajectory in a single winter week, yet even admiration came with consequence. Because if Patton's model was correct, then many cherished assumptions, British, Allied, even Churchill's own, were dangerously outdated. And reckoning with that truth would strain alliances at the very moment victory came into view. February-March 1945. By now the question was no longer theoretical. The Western Front was moving fast. German resistance was collapsing not in dramatic last stands but in sudden absences. Units were found retreating without orders. Supply depots were abandoned intact. Prisoners arrived confused, exhausted, convinced the Americans were everywhere at once. This was the aftershock of Bastogne. The Ardennes had not just broken the German offensive, it had broken the German sense of control. Wherever George S. Patton advanced, the same pattern repeated. Enemy units were outpaced, outflanked, and psychologically overwhelmed. The Germans had prepared to fight methodical pressure. They had not prepared to fight an enemy that refused to slow down. By every known rule of warfare, such momentum should have burned itself out. It didn't. Instead, it multiplied. Entire German formations surrendered without decisive engagement, not because they were surrounded, but because they no longer believed escape was possible. Patton's columns seemed to arrive before German orders did. Roads became traps. Rivers ceased to be barriers. German officers later admitted the truth: they could no longer think fast enough. At Allied headquarters, the data was impossible to ignore. Patton's Third Army was covering more ground, capturing more prisoners, and sustaining offensive pressure longer than any comparable formation. Churchill watched these developments with a sense of grim clarity. History was taking sides. Privately, he began comparing Patton not to his contemporaries, but to figures from Britain's own martial past, commanders who had been difficult, controversial, and effective in equal measure. Men who made others uncomfortable. And won anyway. In conversations with American leadership, Churchill's tone shifted. He spoke less about restraint, more about exploitation. Less about holding ground, more about denying the enemy recovery. The Ardennes had recalibrated his instincts. That recalibration did not come without friction. British commanders worried that Patton's pace risked overextension, friendly fire incidents, and political complications. They argued that the Germans were already beaten, that there was no need to gamble further. Churchill countered with a cold observation. Wars are most dangerous when victory seems inevitable. Delay gave the enemy time to regroup, negotiate, or collapse into chaos that would cost more lives to untangle later. Speed, he believed now, could shorten suffering. It was a brutal calculus, one forged in December's snow. As Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine, debates over tempo reached their peak. Traditional doctrine demanded overwhelming preparation. Patton's record suggested that hesitation itself was now the greater danger. When the crossings came, they came faster than German planners believed possible. And the enemy broke again. Captured German officers spoke openly during interrogations. The Americans, they said, had learned how to fight like Germans, but better. Faster decisions, relentless pursuit, no pause to let the front stabilize. The psychological blow was profound. The Germans had built their early war successes on speed and initiative. Now those same weapons were turned against them. Churchill absorbed these reports with a mix of satisfaction and unease. He understood that Patton's approach worked, but also that it carried risks Britain had long tried to avoid. Yet history was not waiting for comfort. In a private discussion with Dwight D. Eisenhower Churchill acknowledged what he had resisted for years. He had misjudged Patton, not the man's temperament that remained volatile, but the man's understanding of modern war. Patton treated time as expendable for the enemy and priceless for himself. Every delay imposed on German decision-making widened the gap until resistance collapsed under its own confusion. This was not recklessness. It was a theory of war tested under the worst conditions imaginable, and it had survived. By March 1945, Allied victory was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was how the war would be remembered. As a triumph of careful coordination, or as proof that speed once unleashed could end wars faster than caution ever could. Churchill already knew his answer. And when the war finally ended, he would make it clear, carefully, diplomatically, but unmistakably, that one American general had forced him to rethink everything he believed about how wars were won. One final part remains, because the most revealing words Churchill ever spoke about Patton were not delivered in Parliament. Not spoken to generals, but said quietly after the guns had fallen silent. December 1945. The guns fell silent, but the reckoning did not. Victory in Europe arrived not with triumph alone, but with exhaustion so deep it dulled celebration. Cities lay shattered, millions were dead. The speed of the final advance had shortened the war, but not its cost. In London, Winston Churchill stood before Parliament on Victory Day and spoke with measured restraint. He praised unity, sacrifice, endurance. He named many commanders. He spoke of Patton only briefly. Publicly, Churchill was careful. Alliances were fragile in peace. Comparisons could reopen wounds. Praise, if too sharp, could sound like indictment. But privately, the tone was different. In conversations recorded by aides and confidants, Churchill returned again and again to one moment in the war, the Ardennes. To that impossible promise. To the winter gamble that logic said should have failed. He spoke of it not as a fluke but as revelation. Patton, he said, had understood something many others had missed, that modern war punished hesitation more ruthlessly than risk. That time once lost could never be recovered. That momentum was not recklessness, it was pressure applied so relentlessly the enemy ceased to think. Churchill compared him to Britain's great naval captains, men who violated convention, ignored comfort, and forced battle on their own terms. Men who were difficult, politically inconvenient, and indispensable in crisis. Patton belonged to that lineage. In private correspondence, Churchill admitted something rare. He had been wrong to dismiss Patton as merely theatrical. Wrong to believe caution alone saved lives. Wrong to assume doctrine defined possibility. The relief of Bastogne had cracked open assumptions Churchill himself had helped shape over decades. It showed that preparation did not always mean delay, and that boldness, when married to planning, could compress suffering rather than prolong it. When George S. Patton died suddenly in December 1945, the news struck Churchill harder than expected. He had not known Patton well, they were never friends, but warriors recognize warriors. Churchill dictated a statement that revealed more than intended. Patton, he said, was a commander of the First Order, imperfect, aggressive, relentless. His relief of Bastogne would stand among